Welcome, welcome, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Welcome back for a behavior analyst talks about climate change and long-term contingencies. Over the next 2 hours, you're going to have the chance to earn 2 CEUs. And the way you'll earn those CEUs is, well, just about 2 hours, I should say, 100 minutes. You'll have the chance to earn 2 CEUs, and the way you'll earn those CEUs is by staying the entire time. So you're going to stay till 3:10 Eastern time. And then you'll also be answering poll questions that are going to be popping up on your screen. So hopefully you used a join webinar button that was emailed to you. Please do not distribute that email to a colleague or a family member or anybody else that wants to go. Please make sure that they register themselves and get their own unique link. That button is a unique link to you specifically, your name, your email, your everything. Okay, so if you've done that already, or if you haven't, or I'm sorry, if you've done that already, then so far you are all set. If you need to purchase CEUs because you haven't done that, you can do that anytime. I will be looking at the attendance and poll data first thing tomorrow, so that's when you'll be getting your CE certificates. If you only need a general certificate of completion, that's going to be automatically emailed to you, and that's going to come a few hours after we end here today. If you have any questions throughout the presentation today, go ahead, throw them in the questions box. I'll be fielding them and answering the ones that I can. Otherwise, we will have time for Q&A throughout and after the webinar. And if you didn't get a copy of the handout that I sent out a couple of hours ago, then you can download it under handouts. But all right, that's all I got to say for now. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlie.
Well, greetings, everyone. So we're in the midst of talking then about climate change this time, a big topic and a controversial one. So let me at least give you the trigger warning. Most attendees today should find some of the content of this presentation disturbing and maybe even offensive. If that's not the case, then I will not have been successful in the way I do this. I will, as usual, be drawing from the kinds of organization presented in my ABCs book, and this is mainly to show you that if you're interested in following through on some of the things there, and you go to the link with Sloan Publishing, you can get a discount. But I also want to mention that a good hunk of this content also involves a paper with my colleague Dave Stallman, at Mary Washington College in Virginia. By the way, if you're Virginians, I hope you're voting. I won't tell you how to vote, but I hope you're voting. Anyway, so some of it is drawn by that, and at least earlier on, a reprint of that article should have been available for download. We'll also want to mention that some of the content today will be influenced a little bit by a seminar or a webinar that was done just late last week for behavior analysts in climate action. I found that some of the content there did have an influence on the way that I organized a few things in this presentation. So let me then proceed immediately with the first poll question. Marissa will presumably set that up, and we'll get some data from you folks. How do you feel about global warming? Select one of the following. Alarmed or concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive.
Alrighty, everybody take some time. A blue box should have popped up on your screen, and you should be able to select an answer and lock it in with that submit button. Please do not put your poll question answers in the questions box. I won't be able to get data from there. I'll only be able to see questions, so please don't put them there. If you have trouble with the blue box, go ahead and throw your answer in either the body of an email or a Word document, and you can send them to me after the webinar, and that will perfectly suffice for your participation. If you need CEUs, you need to participate in these poll questions. They are a requirement. If any of them are content-based, and you get the question wrong, then don't worry, it will not count against you. If you only need a general certificate of attendance and you don't need CEUs, then you don't necessarily need to participate in these poll questions. However, feel free if you want to. We love to get, the uh, audience participating.
Yeah,
Alrighty,
we'd
let's
certainly
put
like
this one down.
on this particular one. Yeah.
And it looks like 81% are alarmed or concerned, 11% are cautious, no one's disengaged, 6% are doubtful, and 3% are dismissive.
Okay, interesting. By the way, I had mentioned that this was influenced by the Six Americas talk um, by the behavior analysts and climate action group. And what I did for the purpose of this poll is because the details don't allow 6 alternatives easily. I pooled the first 2, and what the case being made by that group was that if you're going to try to change people's views on these kinds of things, you got to know where they stand. And it turns out that the tactics that we might come up with for engaging people who come from these different audiences should depend upon which of these groups they belong to. I'm happy to see that most of the folks are in the first group. So let's move on then to some substance. I ought to warn you right away, by the way, that I'm going to be providing a lot of framework and context within which to think about climate change issues. I'm actually going to be talking a lot more about that context than about climate change itself, but I hope you'll find that this is all nonetheless relevant. Let me go back a little bit to Skinner, who wrote about selection in biology and in behavior. One of the misunderstandings about Skinner is to talk about him in terms of conditioning and associations and all those old-fashioned things, but really the key to understanding behavior analysis and Skinner's work is selection, analogous to selection as it came up in biology with Darwin's work. And so this is one of his earliest explicit statements about the parallels in both operant conditioning. See, even then, back in 1953, he was using the word conditioning. We tend not to use that anymore. We talk about selection instead. But in both operant, if I were writing that now, or if you were writing it now, he'd probably say in both operant selection and the evolutionary selection of behavioral characteristics, consequences alter future probability. Reflexes and other innate patterns of behavior evolve because they increase the chances of survival of the species, more specifically the members of that species. Operants go strong because they are followed by important consequences in the life of the individual. So much of the work that we do then is looking at the selection of behavior by its consequences within the lifetime of the individual organism. Actually, though, we can also add a third class. So there's natural, or what we'll call phylogenic selection, which is the selection by the environment of individuals from populations, and therefore the selection by the environment of genetic populations, what used to be called species. That's a class of organisms, the boundaries for which are more flexible than we humans used to think. But in introducing Skinner's quotation there, I was moving on to the topic of operant or ontogenic selection, selection of behavior by its consequences within the lifetime of the individual organism. And for us, of course, shaping is the quintessential feature of that kind of selection. It will happen in natural environments, but we also can do it in the laboratory. And then we can move on to a third category. Skinner tended to talk about cultural selection. Richard Dawkins came up with the notion of the meme as something transmitted from one individual to another. That was something in somebody's head, like the catchy tune that you, or the earworm that you can't get rid of. But actually, it also would be classes of behavior like the phonemes of a particular language, which get passed on from among the various speakers of the language and from one generation to the next. So we're talking about that kind of selection when we want to discuss the selection of behavior as it's passed on from one individual to another. It's the differential reproduction of behavior as it spreads among individuals. And to have a name that parallels the phylogeny and the ontogeny terms for the other kinds of selection, we're going to be using the term sociogenic. That was a term that was existed for a little while early in the 20th century, and then it sort of went out of fashion, and in part because it was tied in with the so-called science of eugenics, which turned out to be very problematic. But the term essentially then became obsolete, and since it's not in use particularly, it seems very convenient for our account. And so when we want to distinguish among the three varieties of selection, it's nice to have parallel kinds of terms. Let's delve into this a little further, though, because there's some things that we ought to recognize about them. First of all, we may think about the second kind, the operant selection, the stuff that we do, as involving behavior, but the history in biology of phylogenic selection and Darwin and all leads us to think more about species and their different anatomies. So we need to be reminded that in each variety of selection, behavior is primary. Behavior always comes first. Organisms do not survive if they cannot feed themselves, if they cannot find sources of water, if they're terrestrial animals at least. The species will not continue if they cannot locate mates. The species will not continue if they all fall subject to prey to predators. So everything about these organisms then is evolving in the service of what they can do. Our anatomies, our skeletons, our nervous systems, our muscles, everything about us, our sensory systems, all of that is in the service of behavior. And if you don't have it in the service of behavior, then you're going to lose out in that competitive selection. Now, selection can be based on structure. There are certain kinds of structures that are very limited. The genetic system can make some kinds of changes, but not others. So only certain kinds of anatomies allow the development of jawbones. Only certain kinds of anatomies allow the development of certain kinds of limbs. There are limitations on selection based on structure, but also based on function, what these kinds of behavior do. We have to worry a little bit about that, not only because it's important in the things that we study. We have learned that, for example, operants are not defined by what they look like, but rather what they do. They're defined by their function rather than their structure. But this distinction is also significant because it corresponds to the distinction between anatomy and physiology and biological systems. And if we want to move on to the third level of selection, there, one of the most important kinds of selection that involves passage of behavior from some individuals to the other is in our human verbal behavior. And there, verbal behavior can have structure. Linguists worry about grammar, for example, but verbal behavior clearly also has function, and the minimal function of verbal behavior always has to be, we humans have developed this very elegant way in which some individuals can get other individuals to do something very efficiently. That's the function of verbal behavior. So at each of these three levels, we want to be careful to recognize whether we're interested in function, whether we're interested in structure, and how they interact. It's even more complicated than that. These three varieties of selection don't need to work together. Just because selection is moving in one direction at the level of phylogeny in the Darwinian realm, say, doesn't mean that in the operant realm, the same kinds of things are going to happen. So, for example, drug addiction, there you've got the behavior of the individual having been selected, and drug taking has been shaped up perhaps by a drug dealer, who knows, but that behavior of taking the drug is reinforced by the drug effects. That's an ontogenic thing. That's within the lifetime of this particular individual. But if it's a drug that damages a developing fetus, if the drug taker happens to be a pregnant woman, then that's going to have phylogenic consequences. That's going to affect the next generation. There are things that may even have permanent effects that are passed on that way. To take another example, advances in medicine may be part of cultural practices so that children are more likely to survive, which also feeds into phylogenic selection. But the advances in the cultural practices are sociogenic. But other cultural practices, for example, resisting immunizations, may just do just the opposite. Their children may be at risk if they're not immunized. So that's another example. Third example, cultural contingencies are also directed at changing behavior that would otherwise be maintained by natural contingencies. So when religions prescribe certain classes of sexual behavior, they will be affecting not only the passing on of certain kinds of cultural practices, but they may also be affecting phylogenic selection. For example, celibacy may benefit, there may be things about celibacy that are advantageous to a group that practices that, but individuals will be phylogenically disadvantaged by it. So whenever we're looking at these kinds of selections, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that they're going to all push in the same direction. But some of the really important things to recognize are the situations in which they work against each other. And we have to be alert to that. Okay, and of course, if we've got to be alert to these interactions, we've got to recognize, just as there are multiple causes of behavior at our ontogenic level, at any level of selection, we've got to worry about multiple consequences. So, for example, we're going to talk later about sexual selection. And if the peacock's tail has gotten very elaborate because of the preferences of the peahen, or the male giraffe's neck has gotten very long because of the preferences of the female giraffe, nevertheless, those anatomies may be disadvantageous. There are problems. Well, we won't worry about whether the male giraffe can end up with a stiff neck. Male giraffes also, with the very long necks, fight each other by hitting their necks against each other. So I guess they can end up with stiff necks. So there are advantages and disadvantages at every level. We have different behavior classes that may be competing with each other, and that may occur mainly because some of them involve fairly short delays to the important consequences, the reinforcers, whereas others long delays. And depending upon the way we see it go, we may talk about impulsivity, we may talk about self-control, but these are the kinds of things we worry about when behavior can have different kinds of consequences. At the level of sociogeny, it would be good to understand how child-rearing practices may lead to similar behavior on the part of those children when they become adults and become parents themselves. And anything from patterns of child abuse to certain religious traditions, all of these may be passed on, but will interact with other kinds of things. So, for example, if child abuse is somehow maintained in families that behave in certain ways, that may have spin-offs with respect to all sorts of consequences. And one of the ones that I think is especially important for us in these days when we see so much happening in the world that involves aversive stuff, we may wonder about, we tend in our activities to want to emphasize reinforcement. We want to talk about being positive and all. And yet we see so much in the way of aversive control out there. We look around the world and we have wars and conflicts and so forth. One of the things we have to recognize is that it's easy to teach punishment. If you deliver a punisher, it has an effect usually right away. You see something happen. If a child is misbehaving and you deliver a punisher, the child may just stop that for the moment. Whereas we have to learn how to deliver reinforcers effectively, and we might not see the effects until some time has passed. Well, if the one has quick effects, even though it might in the long term be problematic, and the other has slow effects, then maybe that's one of the reasons why one of them tends to be overwhelmed by the others. So always we've got interactions and complications. That's, after all, it's behavior. Behavior is complicated. What our job is to find some of the underlying simplicities and things that run through all of these different examples to try to make sense of it all. Now, okay, so you have to have selection. If you have selection, you can only have selection working if you have variations. And what you would best like to have is variations where if you deliver some reinforcers, you're going to have some spread to other variations, because you couldn't have shaping if you didn't have that. Problem for Darwinism in its early days was that the only kind of genetics that people knew anything about was Mendelian genetics. And the trouble with Mendelian genetics is all it gives you is the dominant and recessive. There was no basis for the variations that would let Darwinian selection work. And it was only early in the 20th century when the biologists began to study genetics and work with an organism that they could look at many generations of Drosophila, the fruit fly, and they found that there were spontaneous mutations, spontaneous changes, and those spontaneous changes were what rescued Darwinism and provided the variation that allowed Darwinian work to work. Interestingly, if you move on to the kinds of critiques that behavior analysis has run into, some of those, and especially those coming from Chomsky, argued that operant selection couldn't provide novelty. And if they couldn't provide novelty, then there couldn't be any variations upon which selection depends. So Chomsky talked about limitations in the stimulus, that there had to be a built-in language acquisition already, and that we didn't have anything to say about sources of novel productions. But we now have many sources of novel behavior. We've got them in the extensions of equivalence classes, and we've got them in shaping, and we've got them in adjunctive, in various cases with different kinds of behavior can come together in novel ways. So that is no longer a problem for us. One more thing, let's also distinguish between artificial selection and natural selection. Artificial selection was around even before Darwin came along and extended selection to natural contingencies. Artificial then was not so much the kind of word we think, it's artificial, it's fake, it's not real. But artificial was something made with art, with artifice. It was the humans who selected the breeding of animals in animal husbandry, or selected the breeding of plants in farming. And that artificial selection then was something that people talked about even when evolution was recognized as something that happened, but people didn't have much to say about what made it happen. And Darwin's contribution was not to come up with the idea of evolution. That was around since the 18th century, and Lamarck and early biologists, other earlier biologists. But Darwin was interpreting evolution in terms of selection. And he then said, well, okay, if we do those things with artificial selection, what if natural environments do the selecting too? Well, with ontogenic selection, that too can be artificial and natural. If we go into the lab, or if we start shaping the behavior of a pet using clicker training or whatever, that's artificial selection, and that we're doing it just as farmers do it with breeding plants that have desirable characteristics like healthier crops or more bountiful crops. But the hunting skills of some predators get shaped up over time. The very young fox or the very young predatory cat learns better and better ways of capturing its prey. And similarly, the prey learn ways of getting away from their predators, although if they're not successful right away, they don't last very long. But in any case, there too, we can see a distinction between the artificial and the natural. And in our case, the problem we've usually run into is that most folks recognize that we can shape for the behavior of zoo animals or shape the behavior of pets, but they argue about whether things like our human verbal behavior is ever shaped by its consequences. Well, we know that it can be, but convincing others that verbal behavior itself can be shaped is a big job. And actually, as we'll see later, it's one of the key issues in the heart of getting people to deal with climate change. Well, if you got the distinction between artificial and natural selection at the level of phylogeny, with Darwinian selection at the level of ontogeny, with shaping and so on, then yes, we should expect to see it at the level of sociogeny. And so we do have systems for teaching. We teach science to school kids, and we do that explicitly, and we set up classes, and we don't necessarily do it very well, although we should be better at that than a lot of others. If we can teach it to kids who have various kinds of developmental difficulties or so on, we should be able to teach it to anybody. But unfortunately, it's a very big system that we've got to get into to make those changes. Some of you who work with those kinds of circumstances already know. I don't have to tell you that. But there's other kinds of shaping that happens that involves transmission of behavior across individuals. So, for example, as the child is babbling in the cradle and the child is hearing the sound of her own voice, then to the extent that those sounds more or less resemble the sounds of the caregivers, the sounds that mommy and daddy make, that correspondence between the sounds produced by the infant or the child and the sounds produced that the child has been hearing will shape the articulation so that somebody who's raised in an English-speaking household will end up producing the phonemes of the English language. Somebody in a Japanese household will end up with those phonemes. Pick any one you want around the world, and you'll find in each language there are sets of phonemes, but in each case, that child's articulations had to be shaped by correspondences between these very sophisticated movements, and it happens over a period of years. So, well, okay, so these are the three classes of selection. They are crucial to some of the other things we're going to move on to, but let's stop for a moment and ask a question about this. Here's poll question number 2.
Alrighty, everybody. What gets selected at every level of selection? Awesome. Thank you all for voting so quickly. Alrighty, I'll shut this down in a few seconds. Okay, looks like 6% say the nervous system, 55% say behavior, and 39% say evolutionary contingencies.
Okay, the reason, by the way, that it's not the set of evolutionary contingencies doesn't get selected, it's what does the selection. So, but it has to be behavior at every level. As I mentioned, it's in the service of behavior that our nervous systems and our skeletal systems evolve. Okay, let's move on now. Now we've already then talked about these 3 different kinds of selection. So the next thing I want to go to is to talk about short-term and long-term contingencies in selection. Okay, a short-term contingency would be something where you do something and right away something happens. Long-term contingency is that over the long run, there are other kinds of consequences. And we'll be now soon be considering examples. They can support each other, they can oppose each other, and they can happen at any level of selection. For example, in biological selection, the phylogeny, the Darwinian sort, the short-term benefits of finding a mate may in the long term drive the species to an evolutionary dead end. If the peahen is most attracted by the peacock with the most spectacular tail, and that goes on generation after generation, and the tails get bigger and bigger, and then there's going to be a point at which the investment of energy by the peacock, the more likelihood that a predator will pick it off, because the bigger the tail is, the more then isn't the short-term benefit of finding a mate, we could play that off against the long-term effect on the species. We tend to admire these kinds of spectacular things, but in biology, there's more and more recognition that some of these are driving some of these species into evolutionary dead ends, and the situations where those species become less and less likely to survive relative to others that are more generalists. Now, in the selection of behavior, if we talk about our operant selection, we're much more familiar with those kinds of distinctions, the short-term consequences, the long-term consequences. We know that impulsivity is one of the defining characteristics of whether we're going to define a kid as having as being hyperactive. And we also talk about showing self-control in cases where somebody might otherwise be impulsive. And given the topic today, the crisis of climate change illustrates similar contingencies that operate at the level of sociogeny. It's pretty obvious. What are we going to do today, and what will we worry about tomorrow? Well, if it's summertime and the temperature is high, and you have air conditioning available, you turn it on. The immediate consequences is you don't suffer some of the problems of a really, really hot environment. But that air conditioning uses energy, and the long-term effect, if you have billions of people beginning to take advantage of that, is that those long-term consequences may actually change the world. And that, of course, is the topic that we're going to end up talking about in a bit more detail. But let's get back to the more specific examples to set this up. Let's begin with operant selection because it's what we are most familiar with. And let's talk a little bit about Faustian bargains and primrose paths. The Faustian bargain, what is that? Okay. That's when someone agrees to trade something of immense but deferred value for something less valuable but immediately gratifying. Faust was offered youth for a while, but after the term was up, the devil would then take his soul. Okay, and it's a literary example. You can read it in Goethe's Faust, or you can listen to the opera or whatever. But what Faust did was to make what we now call a Faustian bargain. All else being equal, the immediate reinforcer is more powerful in shaping and controlling behavior than the deferred consequences. And we know that organisms often produce immediate reinforcers at the expense of larger later ones. We sometimes talk about impulsiveness, and sometimes if we see it doesn't happen, we talk about self-control or we talk about commitment. And we have a vast literature. This is just to quickly give you a notion of where we go to get at that literature. This is a delay of reinforcement gradient in which we're looking at the likelihood of responding as a function of the delay from one response. In this particular instance, it's a response on one of two keys. The response from a given left response to the eventual reinforcer. This, where the little asterisk is here, is the last response on the left. And the way this experiment is set up, only if a certain delay passes will the next right response produce a reinforcer. So we know that this right response is always separated from the last left response by this delay. And we can now look at how much left responding we get. And we see that it follows this very elegant function. It's a quantitative function. On the basis of experiments like that, we can create delay of reinforcement gradients. Once we do that, we recognize that there may be individual differences, so that some individuals, their behavior may be characterized by a fairly shallow delay gradient, so that even responses a long way back still contribute with the effects of the reinforcer. And there may be other individuals who have a much steeper gradient, so that responses have to be close together in time to be impacted much by the reinforcer, and we could expect different kinds of behavior from those different individuals. One of them might be more impulsive than the other, and so on. So we now have this huge literature, and it involves not only non-human, non-verbal behavior, but we also can extend it to human delayed discounting, in which how much would you take now for getting us? How much money would you take right now, as opposed to getting more money if you wait later, and so forth. And there are mathematical models and so forth. Here's an example of a kind of an experiment you can look at. This is one in which you're looking at pigeons' pecks on either two white keys, and the peck on the left one produces one set of conditions. You can think of it as a bird going into one room where there are now a red key and a green key. If the bird pecks the red key, then it will get 2 seconds of food followed by a 6-second delay, and it'll come around to this condition again. If the bird pecks the green key, there'll be a 4-second delay followed by 4 seconds of food. Notice that's mainly to keep the whole time here. It's 8 seconds here, 8 seconds there. Keep that constant. What we find if we were looking only at this situation is the bird would almost always take the smaller reinforcer, the 2 seconds of food, rather than wait the delay and take the 4 seconds of food. So the bird would always be impulsive. If the bird goes into the other condition by pecking the right key, it only gets the green key. And there, once it pecks that key, there will be a 4-second delay and we'll get 4 seconds of food. By pecking, what we find is that the bird will preferentially put itself into the condition where it commits itself to the longer delay. And we can make sense of that by starting to look at different delays crossing over. Well, anyway, I could spend a lot of time on this, but there's a huge experimental literature. But the point is that this is a well-established phenomenon in our science and operant selection. And one of the things I want to do now is to show how similar kinds of relationships exist at the other levels, but also to spell it out in a little bit more detail. We don't only have the distinction between a small reinforcer now and large one later. We look at the small aversive now and the large aversive later. So you go to the dentist, and by doing that, you don't end up with a big tooth problem later on. You can have a small reinforcer now, like smoking cigarettes, and you can have a big aversive later if you end up with lung cancer. You can have a small aversive now and have a relation to a large reinforcer. So if you work out now, if you don't do that later, you lose the competition. So now one of the curious things is when you start laying these out and look at how it works, it's mainly in the third category that we have the conjunction and rather than or, but that's the Faustian bargain. The small reinforcer now and the large aversive later. Youth now for a while versus eternal hell later. Of course, only the very young, only you folks out there would regard a few extra years of youth as a small reinforcer. Hey, a few extra years of youth, I'd go for it, but maybe not in the Faustian situation. So these are the kinds of the differences between short-term and long-term that we have to grapple with. It can get complicated, but now we're going to move on shortly to talking about it at the other levels. But first, let's have another question. Here we go with poll question number 3. Let's see if you can get this one.
Alrighty, everybody. So in behavior analytic terms, Faust's bargain might be described as, go ahead and pick your best answer. Awesome. Thank you all for voting. We'll shut this down. Okay, looks like 25% say self-control, 33% say delayed gratification, 36% say impulsivity, and 6% say greed.
How interesting. Certainly, he didn't delay his gratification. He got it right away. He got the youth right away. So he certainly didn't delay his gratification. What came later was his paying the price for it. And self-control, he certainly didn't show self-control. If he'd showed self-control, he wouldn't have gotten involved with this Satan guy anyway. And of course, greed is not a behavior analytic term. So impulsive is what he was. He took the short-term gratification. That's why he settled for he took the bargain and presumably paid for it later. Anyway, let's move on. In general, what I'm doing here, by the way, is showing you an example of what turns out to be a very useful tactic when we're trying to extend the analysis behavior and to other realms. That is, we're trying to figure out the properties of selection. We study selection when we do shaping. We also learn about selection from the biologists, and we can look at sociology and other disciplines and look at how behavior and our own work with verbal behavior, and look about at how behavior gets selected at the sociogenic level. But maybe, given that it's selection at each of these levels, we can learn something by seeking parallels among them. And I have found that over recent years to be a more and more useful technique. You look at the way selection works, and you look at what kinds of things have been studied by people in other disciplines as well, and then you ask, are the same kinds of things going on in our discipline? So, for example, in biology, there's a distinction between blueprints and recipes when you're talking about phylogenetic selection. In the early days of trying to figure out what was going on in evolution, there were people who were talking about copies of organisms being passed on. Lamarckian selection, which is that you could acquire acquired characteristics during the life of the parent could be passed on to the offspring, suggests that there had to be some kind of a copy of what the organism was like to be passed on, of what the parent was like to be passed on to the offspring. And there were homunculi and other kinds of things. But then along came the biologists who began figuring out how DNA worked, and they distinguished between a copy and a recipe. The genes are not like blueprints for an organism. You can't find a picture of an organism in the genes. Rather, the genes are recipes for producing certain proteins and other biochemical substances that are involved in the development of the new organism. So they're ways to produce the new organism, but they're not pictures of it. Well, we've had problems in ontogenic selection in talking to people who come out at the same issues as cognitive psychologists, and they too have created problems because if they're talking about representations as being copies, then we don't do that. We don't make copies of things out there in the environment when we respond to them. We don't make copies of a word that we see. If we say the word, we're changing that visual stimulus, the printed word, into a spoken bit of behavior on our part. They're by no means copies. When cognitive psychology works well, they're talking about representations. They're talking about those kinds of changes from the dimensions of the stimulus to the dimensions of the response. And both they and we can get into trouble if we're looking for copies instead. So that's a parallel between the evolutionary contingencies and in phylogeny and our operant contingencies. And there are similar kinds of things we could come up with at the sociogenic level. Again, if we were looking at how we learn about previous histories, the study of evolution in the early days, especially Darwin's critics were looking at and talking about the gaps in the fossil records. You'd only get these occasional fossils that the skeletons of which survived in particular geological circumstances But there were big periods of time in which we didn't have much to go by. That record's being filled in over time in paleontology, but still, there was always the problem of interpretation. Well, when we go looking at behavior, then the records of past behavior are a problem for us because how do we reconstruct the history of selection that led a kid to behave in a certain way? So just as the paleontologists may worry about how the primates evolved, and they only have these little occasional bits of clues from various surviving fossils, what do we do when we find a child who throws tantrums in the supermarket? We could make some guesses as to where that behavior came from. But if we start doing functional analyses to try to figure it out, and we may see bits of behavior that are still incorporated into that give us clues to reconstruct that history. But noticing, recognizing those parallels and recognizing that the problems exist, it's not just our problem, it's a problem for those who want to study selection in general, is useful. And randomness, well, that makes it harder to analyze things too, but randomness in mutations and randomness in the production of new responses in operant classes, those are crucial because they provide the source for the variations on which selection operates. So once we begin seeing those in one realm, then we should look for similar kinds of things in the other. And one of the places where one sees that is in the work of Alan Nuringer and the sources of variability, which, by the way, make a very strong case for the crucial importance of diversity in the evolution of populations. And that will be a topic for another time, though. Moving on a little bit, selection itself creates the classes. From Darwin on, there have been arguments about what species are. Darwin created problems because before he came along, religious views were that the species were given at the time of the flood, and pretty much it was the ones that got on the ark that survived in pairs and so forth. Well, of course, that was just so story, despite the fact that there's a museum that's built in an ark out in the Midwest somewhere. But Darwin himself thought that the concept of species was a kind of a convenience, and he said it was hard to distinguish between varieties and other subclasses. And even now, there are various ways of measuring these classes, of trying to come up with ways to distinguish them. There's the area of biology called cladistics, which is about determining the classes that hang together. And we, of course, still have those kinds of issues. So, for example, the status of race remains an issue, even though there's no really good biological basis for maintaining that we consist of different races. And Darwin, right from the beginning, saw all humans as being this part of a single species. And he found it very disturbing to confront what was going on in the society of his day, and no doubt he would if he saw it in our day as well. Well, in ontogeny, we found that Skinner too had to worry about what the classes were. What's an operant class? He finally got to saying that it had to be the function. Whether you're defining lever presses or key pecks, or you're worrying about attention getting or self-injurious behavior, those are classes of responses, and they tend to be defined most effectively when we do our functional analyses by looking at what the responses in those classes do. What is their function? And if we go on to cultural selection, there too, boundaries are a particular issue. If we're interested in verbal behavior, what makes the boundaries between classes of phonemes? If you're raised in an Arabic household, you won't hear the difference between B and P. There's a single consonant that's somewhere in between. But you'll hear it perfectly well if you're raised in an English-speaking household. And if you're lucky enough to be raised in a household that has both, then you'll learn both classes. But we shouldn't expect that we're going to find the answers by going looking inside the brain, because whatever brain structure ended up allowing discriminations between P's and B's or whatever other class of consonants you're interested in, or those brain structures were driven by an environment in which those differences existed in the stimulus classes that selected the attending behavior and the other features of the children whose behavior was selected. So here again, these are the three levels again: phylogeny, ontogeny, and sociogeny. And actually, there should have been sociogeny rather than cultural selection here in this last one, but I didn't update that. I just realized I didn't update that one. Moving on, they also have higher order classes, the nesting of classes. So in operant behavior, you can have generalized imitation, generalized matching. It's not particular matching, but the relations between the stimuli that begin to be important. And if we start looking at phylogeny, of course, you've got the nesting of cells within organ systems inside organisms. Some organisms nested within others if you have symbiotics or parasitism and so forth. At the level of cultural selection, we have all sorts of nestings: letters and words, words and sentences, sentences and paragraphs, chapters, books. Now you could try to just describe these in terms of structure and ground everything in terms of structure. You might want to call some of the structures frames, but doing that tends to leave out the contingencies that created those classes in the first place. And so you can actually have contingencies in which some subclasses are pitted against others. The class of following orders in the military is different from the class of following a particular order, which may be putting your life on the line. And there can be interactions and incompatibilities between those classes. So everywhere we have to be worrying about these kinds of things. So now let's follow our strategy of seeking these parallels. I was talking about the advantages of looking for these parallels by looking at short-term and long-term contingencies in the phylogenic selection. Okay? In the face of changing environments, generalists have an edge over specialists. So you've got orchids in a rainforest. They have evolved within a particular area. Over time, they've ended up with a particular shape, and it turns out that only an insect, maybe a butterfly, maybe some other thing, having a long proboscis can get it down there to the point where it's going to fertilize. It's going to get some of the pollen and end up going and fertilizing in another flower. And let's suppose that's happened over many, many, many generations of orchids. There are some other competing plants whose flowers are generalized enough that any of a variety of bees or wasps or other insects can fertilize those plants. Now, what do you think happens now if the rainforest begins to be put under environmental pressures? Which ones are going to be the first to go? The first ones to go are going to be the ones that are very highly specialized. The ones who are most generalized, the generalists, the ones who vary the most. In other words, the ones that are most diverse are the ones who are going to survive. Well, let's use some specific examples. I've already mentioned the tail of the peacock. I've also mentioned the long neck of the giraffe. I'll throw in there the bower of the bowerbird. Well, you know about the tail of the peacock. The peacock has this great big tail, and we have pictures of them, and it's really a very elegant looking creature. Now, the story used to be that any peacock that could produce a tail like that has got to be one hell of a healthy peacock. And therefore, peahens who are attracted by peacocks with tails like that will therefore also be selecting the healthiest peacocks. Well, maybe we should be talking instead about poppycock, but that was the story that was around for a very long time. But as we will see in a little bit, we have reason to question it. What about giraffes? Well, I used to start off lectures in my classes when we were talking in the early days, decades ago, about the giraffe's long neck being selected because that allowed the giraffe to get up to fruit high on the tree. Curious thing though, the male necks tend to be a lot longer than the female necks. How come the long necks weren't selected on the parts of the females as well? I gave that I used that particular story Skinner actually drew an analogy between discrimination learning in operant behavior and the selection of things like the long neck of the giraffe by saying it's only in environments with fruit high up in trees, that essentially with the analog of the discriminative stimulus, that the long neck would be selected. Well, at the end of the class, one of the classes in which I did that, one of the students in the class came up and said she had just been to a class in biology. And it turns out that the biologists are not talking about that anymore at all, because the evidence is that the long neck of the giraffe has nothing to do with fruit high in the tree. The long neck on the giraffe is there because female giraffes prefer long-necked males. And in fact, in competition for mates, the giraffes often slap their necks against each other, and then that's the way they fight. Well, then the long neck of the giraffe, the product of sexual selection. By the way, I was later, it was a big class. There were about 140 or more students in it. And it was only years later that I ran into the student who had asked that question, and discovered that she's now doing her work running a school for families with children on the autism spectrum. And so I'm pleased to see that these kinds of that there's a bit of selection of the kinds of content on my part changed by what the student asked, and then that moving on to it being continuing within our discipline. So the long neck of the giraffe is there because female giraffes prefer long necks. The bower is this fancy nest that the bowerbird builds, and these bowerbirds all build these different nests, and the most elaborate nest is the one that the female may prefer. So the male bowerbirds are essentially building these different nests and therefore competing for the attention of the females based on the quality of the nest they build. And there again, it's a similar story. The behavior has led to this kind of behavior over the long run. Now, if you look at the history of this stuff, Darwin identified sexual selection early on as a source of evolutionary change. And years went by, and over the years, gradually it became part of the story, and that the reason that the female selected the male was because the male who could have this property was likely to be healthier, more fit than other males. Turns out that argument was mainly advanced by someone who was essentially close to being a competitor to Darwin, Wallace, who also had a theory of selection. And Wallace continued on, was a younger man, and lived on after Darwin's death. And that story then came to dominate the discussion. But now we have a lot more evidence coming in, and instead other factors may underlie sexual selection without regard to the overall fitness of the male. So for example, you can have a case in which there's a gene that happens to be one that produces a particular male feature, and that happens to be carried by the male, but it also would be carried by females. And you also could have another gene that tends to give females a preference for that feature. Now, if ever these two genes come together so that they're in many males and many females, what you're going to have is a system in which the male is likely to have this feature and the female is likely to prefer it. And once that gets going, you have a thing in which over generations, these features become more and more dominant, and these preferences become more and more dominant, and therefore you drive the species further and further along these extremes. So the peacock's tail gets bigger and bigger and more elaborate, or the giraffe's neck gets longer and longer, or the bowerbird's nest gets more and more elaborate. The trouble with that is like the trouble you have with the orchids, because if you go far enough with that and then the environment changes, or even without the environment changing too much, you become more and more susceptible to predators. If your tail gets big enough, There may be anatomical consequences of longer and longer necks, and so on. If the environment changes, your species may be in jeopardy. So that's a bit like a Faustian bargain at the phylogenic level. These creatures are getting themselves into evolutionary dead ends. The coevolution of peacocks with more impressive ornamentation and peahens with ever stronger preferences for beautiful tails is likely to favor descendants sharing genes supporting both traits, thereby producing ever larger and more beautiful peacock tails and ever more receptive peahen audiences. But there'll be opposing consequences, greater vulnerability to predators, greater metabolic demands. Hey, it takes a lot. You got to eat a lot. You got to produce a tail like that. So with successive generations of walking the primrose path, if that's not familiar to it, it comes from, probably 19th century literature of being led up a path, and it turns out that when you get to the end of the path, it's not so good when you get there. It may be that walking that path puts you more and more at risk of extinction. And in fact, even in his very early writings on sexual selection, Darwin was pretty amazing to see these kinds of contingencies, even based on the data he had available at the time that he did in the middle of the 19th century. But he did speculate that the short-term consequences of some varieties of selection might be maladaptive in the long term. So let's ask a question now. Here's another question coming up.
Alrighty, everybody. So go ahead and take some time to answer this one. Oh, wow. Thank you for voting so quickly already.
Boy, I hope this one was easy.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Oh my goodness, I'm going to cough. I'm going to cough, but it won't let me cough. Oh, wow. This is the worst feeling. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay, I'm going to shut this down. Thank you all for voting. And here are the results.
Well, I don't know where human industrialization came from there, but and okay, some people were probably just guessing, but at least most of you got the correct answer, which is a good thing. All right, moving on. And now it is time to move on to sociogeny. I mean, after all, this is supposed to be about climate change, right? But as I said, we have to set the context for it. And I think you can see where this is going. Okay, I already gave you a behavior analytic example. It's typically easier to use punishers than to use reinforcers. A strong punisher usually has an immediate effect on the punished behavior. The ongoing behavior of the slapped child is likely to stop right now. You reinforce a child's behavior today, you may not see any effects until tomorrow. But this is not about just what's happening with this particular user of punishment, but it's about whether these practices are likely to be passed on to others. And that's where the sociogeny comes in. The administration of punishment typically has more immediate effects than the administration of reinforcers. Probably that's why those folks out in the Midwest, there are some states that still allow corporal punishers with school kids. They still allow kids to get paddled. And it's so easy to do. It's therefore very easily learned. It's very easy for some teachers to teach other teachers how to do it. And therefore it's likely to spread through those cultures, and if there's nothing pushing back against it, if they don't have much behavior analysis in their histories, if they haven't learned much of any of it, then that's going to persist. People are going to be shunned and they will control behavior that way. But over the long run, the use of punishers may be ultimately detrimental relative to the skilled use of reinforcers. And I don't need to spell out all the details. You can work out the differences in the immediacies and the delays and the relevant consequences. It's good exercise. But the point is, here's a case where we can look at the differential delays and differential consequences and see how that can lead to differences in the ways in which things can spread through a culture. And that's, of course, what we're really concerned with when we're worried about climate change, because one of the things that we confront when we worry about it is, well, I can do only so much, and I'm in this environment in which there's so many other people doing other things. How do we get this to spread so that other people begin to engage in relevant behavior? We can each do our bit, but we need to get a lot of people to change their behavior. And this then is one example, and it tells us what we're up against, because it's easier to get some stuff out there than others. And the Six Americas analysis that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, in which they looked at the groups that have different kinds of responses, some of whom were anxious about climate change and others deny it. You certainly, if you're going to change the behavior of those people, you've got to approach them differently. We've got a daunting problem, but let's move on, and we've at least we've arrived at the point where we can consider climate change. And I hope by this point, the short-term, long-term components are pretty obvious. I hope I made that distinction well enough. So what do we have? On the one hand, our individual behavior. It's hot outside, we can turn up the air conditioning. It's cold outside, we can turn up the heat. We can keep on using fossil fuels. We can try to sign a thing that says that the energy that it's going to be coming into our home is going to now be only coming from wind turbines, or only coming from other non-fossil fuel sources. We could even try to go further and try to install solar panels so that we're not taking stuff off the grid that way. We can try to change our eating habits, eating foods that contribute big carbon footprints. Meat ends up producing a much bigger carbon footprint than eating vegetables. Oh, yeah, on the one hand, but we can keep on eating the meat. That's one of the things we can do. We can travel as much as possible, preferably by air. One plane flying across the country creates a lot more of a carbon footprint than an awful lot of cars driving around. And above all, don't let anybody tell you it'll make a difference to change your ways. Go on, keep on turning up the air conditioning and turning up the heat. Keep on using the fossil fuels. Keep eating that stuff. Travel as much as you can, and just don't worry about it. That's how some of us behave, and we can see how that's maintained by lots of immediate consequences. If it's cold outside and you turn up the heat, yeah, things gonna, if your heating system is pretty decent, things are gonna change pretty quickly. But on the other hand, how about limiting your air conditioning? How about turning down the heat? How about minimizing the use of fossil fuels? How about eating foods that leave a small carbon footprint? How about traveling only as really essential, and above all, reinforcing any verbal behavior that supports such action? That's what we'd like everybody to do. So there's our objectives. But isn't it a pipe dream to imagine we can do that? We're talking about a population in the world of billions of people. And we have, even within just one state, one city, one town, even a whole country, we have limited access to ways of creating those changes. But the stakes are high, and we have to keep on considering whether we as a discipline can do anything, can make our contribution. It's too important to neglect. I think this is all pretty obvious stuff. I don't know that I've taught you anything or introduced you. We've heard plenty about how our world may change as the temperature rises, the ice caps melt, the glaciers melt, the permafrost in Siberia starts warming up and reducing and releasing stored carbon dioxide there. In the preceding slides, I showed a variety of examples of widespread behavior that's maintained by short-term consequences. And we've already seen some of the long-term consequences of climate changes, increases in temperatures around the world, more storms, various kinds of consequences, rising sea levels. But climate science suggests that much more is yet to come, and the magnitude of the problem is daunting. I think we'd all agree with that, or at least I hope we'd all agree with that. And besides, climate change isn't the only problem we have to worry about. We could have made the same points with regard to many other crises. How about PCBs in the environment, plastics, other environmental pollutants? They're in rivers, they're in the ocean, they're in the air enough that now we're finding that little microplastics are incorporated in our bodies, and they're doing things, some of which we don't really understand yet. We don't know how bad those effects may be over the long term, particularly on younger members, on kids. And how about the extinction of species, especially including pollinators, as well as some of the predators that maintain ecological balances? They're killing off foxes out west, and yet those foxes contribute to the ecologies and have an effect on things like the growth of grasses and the terrain across the country. How about the depletion of fresh water and other natural resources? When I was an undergraduate, I can recall that we had a course called Contemporary Civilization, which had readings, and there was a reading back then speculating about what was going to happen about now. Of course, I didn't know I'd even get to see now when I was that young. And it was about the worries about what would happen if we depleted the natural resources and so forth. How about the biological threats, pandemics? We've been through one. That was bad enough. There's worries that something else could come along that could hit us again in a different way. And how about the other threats, the ones and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? And when worry there, both nuclear and biological, those are the kinds of things that we have to worry about. Well, I was a kid growing up in the 40s, in the middle of World War II. I wasn't old enough to really understand what was going on, but that was a set of events that was probably difficult to live with if you were an adult at the time and worrying about the future for your kids and so forth. But we're faced with a different kind of thing these days than because, and this is a bit, but anyway, I no point belaboring that. I hope I'm making the point. I wish I had answers, but at least we're more clearly seeing some of our challenges. I'm sure of at least a couple of things. First of all, the diversity of these issues means we need diversity in our responses to them. Wherever I look in biology, the species that includes diversity, and that's species in the plural, are the ones that are most likely to prevail. I've recently blundered into a book called Beasts Before Us by Elsa Panciaroli. And the subtitle is The Untold Story of Mammal Origins and Evolution. And it turns out that, whatever you've seen in Jurassic Park and all, the mammals were around before the dinosaurs, and they're around in great numbers. And this particular book is based on recent paleontology and the uncovering all kinds of fossils that had not been available in earlier times, and it's really changing the way we look at that whole evolutionary tree. Well, one of the messages that comes through again and again throughout that book, while rewriting that whole story of vertebrate evolution, is that wherever there was an opportunity for diversity, then that was key to survival of populations. And after some of the great extinctions, the ones that wiped out the dinosaurs, it turned out that the ones that survived those worldwide catastrophes were the ones that had diverse opportunities for diversity. So we have to treasure diversity. And I'll be talking about that more in an upcoming one of the upcoming webinars here at BDS. So, for example, one of the special things about mammals was our teeth and our jaws. And once the jaws had developed, there was enough opportunity for variations in the way the teeth were inserted in the jaws and the way they came in or not. That was a kind of variation that was not available to reptiles and to some of the other groups, in which the teeth were always more uniform. And that meant you could have herbivores and carnivores and specialists on certain kinds of foods and not on others. So if the environment changes, then there is still the opportunity to take advantage of what remains there. So that's one thing that is hopeful. Now, I would say that if that's true with respect to phylogeny, and we have certainly evidence that variations are advantageous if you're talking about shaping at the level of ontogeny, then how about a wider range of variations making populations more viable under changing contingencies? The classes most at risk are those in very specialized environments. And we know the capacities for variability, preferences for choice have been selected phylogenetically. So environments that allow them, and we would say for our field, those that are least restrictive are those in which adaptive variations are likely to emerge. And then what about verbal behavior? Well, that's a big topic, but one of the things that's problematic about verbal behavior is that it is often more constrained and less variable than contingency shaped behavior. That is a topic that's so complex, I think we have to save it for some other occasion, but at least I want to make the point that it's worth worrying about. So, a conclusion here that cultural diversity and the cultural selection of variants, cultures that celebrate diversity have some advantages over those that engender conformity. Example, Hitler tried to remove Jews and other populations from German culture. He was espousing a social Darwinism that remains as a source of some of the anti-Darwinism that's still around. But when he did that, at least Einstein and many others, they left Europe, and the world would have been different if they hadn't been expelled or expunged and so forth. So diversity matters. Let's have another poll question before I move on to making a few more points. As you can tell, we're moving up to some closure here. Poll question number 5. Here it comes.
Alrighty, everybody. Go ahead and take some time to answer this one as well.
That's a weird question, isn't it? Don't worry
Alrighty.
on this one.
I will shut this down right now. And it looks like 31 or 34% say low levels of diversity, 31% say high levels, and 34% say neither of the above. Diversity is irrelevant.
I guess people were flipping a three-sided coin. Oh, well, it was not a great question. I think diversity is irrelevant to Faust's bargain, but we could have skipped that question. Anyway, moving on. Now, let's get back to verbal behavior just a little bit, though, before we. Human verbal behavior evolved as a way in which some individuals could get others to do things. That is the irreducible function of verbal behavior. It is, you can't think of anything more fundamental that verbal behavior does. I say something, you do something, and I ask you, please stand up. If you stand up, just that little bit of sound that I made gets you to do something. Everything else gets built that way. And no other way of spreading behavior across members of a population is likely to be more efficient than that. And that's what we have as something we can do. On the other hand, verbal behavior can get really screwed up. And all we have to do is look at contemporary politics to say that. So verbal behavior is also the most effective way to introduce remote consequences into current environments. We're talking about stuff that might happen in 2 years or 5 years or 20 years, the end of the century, the end of the millennium. And we've got to get better at doing that, at getting the remote consequences to have an impact on current behavior. That's one of our jobs. We are in a position with respect to verbal behavior of doing some things with verbal behavior that other people might sort of do without having a systematic way of recognizing why that's an important way to do things. That's our responsibility, and we got to find ways to be better at it. But by the way, just to give you a little bit more of the justification of why we have to worry about this stuff, I passed over some of the statistics, and these statistics, by the way, come out of that same book, Beast Before Us, the one on mammalian evolution. And this is the kind of thing for which I put in the trigger warning at the beginning. Remember I said people must be bothered by this. I was astonished that the data are that 70% of world agriculture goes to meat production. 60% of all living mammals are kept by humans for food. That means 1.4 billion cows, 1.8 billion sheep and goats, 980 million pigs. Those groups by themselves make up 34% of all the mammals alive on the planet today. 600 million pet cats, 470 million pet dogs. And so once you go through all of that and you figured out wild mammals now represent just 4% of all living mammals. We worry about whether the elephants are going to survive, whether the whales are going to survive. They represent just 4% of the entire population of living mammals. All the rest of it is our cows and our sheep and goats and all of the other animals that we manage. Birds do a little better. 30% of them are wild. The rest of the birds, the other 70% are livestock, and most of them are chickens. We need to do better. So if this doesn't scare you, I don't know what will. And when I look at things like this, and then I hear about things like there's a local food market here in Maryland, which is called Moms, in which they do all organic stuff, and they do their own sourcing, and they take food that is not being sold off the shelves and give it to food banks. And any food that's left over is not just dumped in the garbage to go to a dump, but is composted. So it goes back into things. They are producing a really small footprint for the people who, well, can we get business like that to increase? Because every time we do something like that, we're making a big dent. That's where the world has to move. But how much can we do? Well, we can think about how we spend our money, how we use our resources. So the 6 Americas data that we started with gave us a start in thinking how to make verbal behavior more effective. At least we can target audiences, and if we know something about where they're coming from, we can try to come up with messages that will be be more likely to change their behavior. And there's a BDS site. I didn't even know about this one until fairly recently. It's the Center for Behavior and Climate. There's a forum for organizing our work relevant to climate change. Here's the URL for it, climate.bds.com. And then also, if you just do a search for climate on the BDS site, you'll be directed there too. My hope is that in the long run, sites like this can get together with other sites. There ought to be something that the Cambridge Center works on along these lines and others. And we ought to be recognized that we were one of the few disciplines that has a handle on changing world behavior, but we don't have enough of the leverage, the money that goes into TV ads and all those kinds of things to make a big dent that way. We've got to figure out ways to do it better. What sort of talk about climate change will be most effective? How do we get such talk going? And asking how we get such talk going, we've also got to recognize that our own talk is not the main concern. If verbal behavior is shaped, we've got to listen to and differentially reinforce the verbal behavior of others, no matter where they fall on the 6 Americas spectrum. One of the things that I recall in that presentation was talking about how when people came up with their own ideas, that they were more likely to be acted upon than if the ideas came from other people. Well, that's the case in which if they were coming up with their own ideas, then other people must have reinforced their presenting the ideas. And what we know is that if you reinforce what people say, you often get the behavior that's consistent with what they've said. So we've got to look at things like that and look about ways in which we can magnify the effects of our interventions so they spread across cultures. It's a daunting task, but what's the alternative? We might as well close out with one more question, and then I have just a couple more points.
Alrighty, so go ahead and take some time to answer. There it is. Kind of.
Hmm. Well, I see a pretty obvious answer. I hope everyone else does too.
Alrighty, thank you all for voting so quickly. I will shut this down. Perfect. Okay. 4% say phylogenic selection. 17% say ontogenic selection. 75% say sociogenic selection, and 4% say geoengineering.
Yay for the 75%. Thank you. Okay, so we're uniquely prepared to deal with talk as behavior and to show how shaping what people say can change what we do. Let's get on with the job. There's no time to lose. But I need feedback. So now, do you have questions for me?
Alrighty, so it looks like there is one question. Would this peacock theory apply to humans as well? If lines of women are attracted to males with abusive tendencies, they're not compatible, leading to generational trauma.
Okay, well, I guess I did suggest along the way that there might be patterns of behavior that are more likely to be passed on from one generation to the next. If a child is observing that parents fight a lot, that might be a kid who ends up fighting with siblings and then ends up eventually becoming a parent and continuing that kind of behavior. So again, is raising kids whose parents fight a lot and so on and so on. That's a way in which that could be continued over generations, but wouldn't necessarily involve a genetic component. Um, so for it to be parallel to the peacock peahen thing, you'd need to have something where there is something genetic that predisposes. Um, uh, two things have to be happening at the same. There has to be something producing the trait on the part of, say, the male, and also producing the preference on the part of the female, because it usually goes in that direction. Um, and I can only make guesses about that. I don't know whether there is a literature that ties that sort of behavior to genetic correlates very well, because almost always there's confounding with local contingencies and then all kinds of other things going on in the world. I don't see it as being, I see it as being a possibility, but I'm not, at least at this point, coming up with any examples of something that might work that way. But I could certainly see cases in which it just persists over generations for other reasons without it being built into the genetics of it, which is, I prefer that because that makes it a little bit more hopeful that over the long run you could do something about it.
Alrighty, well, that was the only question that we had. We do need to go for the next 10 minutes in order to meet the two CEUs. Oh, hi, Steve. All right, let's see. Disinformation and climate denialism is a real problem. Any suggestions?
Oh, Steve, you had to come up with that one. That's one of the toughest ones of all. And if we could solve that problem, we could solve the political problems as well. Um, the 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 sources of verbal behavior seem to be a big problem. We've got these local communities in which people only go to certain websites and they talk to each other. And so it's sort of a mutual reinforcement society, and which sort of ends up amplifying fake news and conspiracy theories and so on. And the climate change deniers are along that dimension. If only there was a simple practice again and again and again. I see people saying things, they're quoted in the newspapers, or you get various articles describing some of these controversies. If it became a characteristic for people to say, well, where did you get the information that led you to say that? Supposing that was simply a thing that was routinely understood that something as a way in which you could follow up on somebody saying something to you. So you go to a website and somebody asserts something, that there's this conspiracy involving predation on children that's being arranged in the basement of this deli in New York City, you know, something like that. And well, where did you hear that? Okay, or where did you get that information? Or can you tell me where I can go to get it? If everybody who heard an outlandish thing came back with that kind of question, that became sort of the routine thing for people to do. If kids were taught to do that in school, okay, teacher, you just told me that, but where can I look it up? And there you got to worry about, you know, oh, well, your textbook says it. The trouble is, if you're in a state like Florida now, where the textbooks are being changed so that as to limit what the kids can read about, then you've got problems. But at least then you could have the follow-up questions. Well, where did the textbooks get the information? I don't see much of that sort of question about sources existing in everyday discourse, and it would be nice to find a way to put it back in. And if we could, and if it could spread, even just among university people, among people who are professionals, among medical people, um, people whose talk has you know, some background in empirical stuff with some kind of credibility along those lines, maybe that could make a difference. But I don't know how you change that in a big way. But actually, now that I've said it, I think if I am confronted with that, I occasionally do if I'm out and around, and most of the people in where I live tend to be compatible politically and along the liberal conservative dimensions, so that I don't run into it very often. But I think I will make it a point when I run into somebody who comes up with some strange claim to follow up with questions about, well, where did you learn that? How did you find it out? Can you help me to check it out? Let's do it together. How about that? Maybe we can make a difference in that direction.
All right. So, oh, here's another one. Let's hear more about shaping what people say, such as reinforcing presentation of ideas.
Well, okay, of course, presentation of ideas is of course very much a colloquialism, but I mean, if you just talk about, um, okay, I have some suggestions for things we might do, like I just did with respect to um, uh, the you could call it an idea, but it was the thing is, ah, let me retreat a little bit. Once people talk, we have this history, and probably it's what makes it so disturbing to so many of us that in politics, the way things are have so little to do with the things that get said. Um, we have sort of a history that language is supposed to be reasonable. It's supposed to be anchored in things that you could look at. And we, particularly if we come out of experimental background or research background, and we always are backing things up with citations. If we talk about an experiment we did, we sure want to make sure that the person who's describing the experiment is accurately telling you what was done and is not distorting what happened in the experiment. But the age of reason was a long time ago, and it didn't last very long. The idea that humans were rational creatures, we're not. If the functions of verbal behavior to get other people to do things, that's giving instructions, and that has nothing to do with truth. I think truth is something we can end up talking about, but it's much more derivative. It takes a lot of other verbal behavior to already be in place before you get to the point of saying, well, how did this verbal behavior get established? And at the root, all of this is, how do these ways we talk about get established? Well, one of the things is, it usually gets established on the basis of saying things that other people have said. Very few of the things we've learned are things we've learned in actual contact with them. We read books. I mean, I'm talking about when was talking about the evolution of the mammals. Good grief, Nobody had contact with those creatures. All we have are these fossil remnants which have been sitting there embedded in rocks for literally millions of years. And from that, we end up constructing sentences which talk about how some of these creatures behaved. Well, they had teeth and they must have, and they lived in an environment where there's a little bit of evidence that they probably ate plants, not other animals, and all of this stuff. So that's a reconstruction we have to do, and we're just at the very beginnings of doing that. I mean, after all, we've only been trying to deal with verbal behavior for less than a century, particularly if you want to date it with, let's not even do it in 57 when Skinner wrote the book Verbal Behavior. Let's put it at his first musings about it, going back into the 20th century. But this we do know. If you take a child, an undergraduate, an adult, and you have them doing some kind of a task and you get them to talk about it, and then you differentially reinforce what they say about what they're doing, you can get skillful enough to get them to change what they say about what they're doing. And if you get good at that, then not only will you change what they say, but what they do will become consistent with what they're saying under some limited set of circumstances. That's a phenomenon for which there are data. There's a literature now. We've done work with, as I say, with preschoolers. We've done work with undergraduates. We've done work with teachers. If you get teachers to say, well, I should use specific feedback rather than generalized feedback in the classroom. I should say to the child, the sentence you just wrote is a good sentence, rather than saying good job. And the reason for doing that is if you say good job, most of the kids who hear that will not know whether you're responding to their behavior or the behavior of some other kid. But if you say this sentence you just wrote is a good one, this kid knows you're talking about this kid's sentence. Well, if you get teachers to say it's better to use the specific feedback than the generalized feedback, then they will do that more often in the classroom. And I'm talking about this is database. I mean, this is a work I did with Nancy Neef at Ohio State and some of her graduate students. Now, I mean, after all, we're talking about a few experiments, we're talking about a few instances, but once we know that if you shape verbal behavior, and it's about something you do and you're going to get the correlated nonverbal behavior out, and that gives us a way of changing behavior. That, in fact, as far as we can tell, one of the reasons why reinforcers tend not to work so well with adults is that you've got to reinforce the verbal behavior related to the behavior you want to change, and not that, and sometimes it's better than trying to reinforce the behavior itself. I mean, I used to, in classroom way back, go talk about, well, if you want to get somebody to come up to your place, do you reinforce ever closer and closer approaches to your place, or do you reinforce the other person's verbal behavior to the point where the person says, can I come up to your place? Okay, pretty clearly, the latter is going to be the way to go. It's more likely to be effective. Don't bother working on the slight movements in the direction of your place, but change the verbal behavior. Once we make the assumption that that's a fairly general thing, then does it apply for somebody getting people to say, I'm going to vote for you? Does that mean that when they go into the booth, that's indeed what they're going to do? If that's the case, then this kind of phenomenon is everywhere. It's especially in politics, and it has nothing to do with truth and reason. It has to do with getting to change the behavior of other people. And we need to figure out how to deal with that. And we need to figure out ways to get it out there to a broader population. It shouldn't be just the thing that we behavior analysts know. The whole world should know those kinds of things, because if we're going to worry about that as a problem, then the more we know about it, the better we can build defenses for it. Right now, it seems like we're in a very vulnerable position as I'm reading the stuff that's going on in politics and worrying about what's going to happen in 2024. They all seem to boil down to questions of verbal behavior. Even if you start thinking about the Supreme Court and all of the stuff that goes into their having supposedly logic for the way the Constitution works, it is essentially the pronouncements of any of the courts are simply instructions that limit the behavior of other people. And we also then need a verbal behavior analysis of legal systems, and as well as political ones. Got a big job out there. There's plenty to do, and we're just scratching the surface. But I don't think there's any alternative. If we don't deal with that, then we're, I think, inevitably in big trouble. So I hope that at least there are some hopeful things in here, and that there are a few things maybe we can do. Thank you for your attention. And
Everybody, thank you. Thank you so much, Charlie. And everybody, if you didn't purchase CEUs as of yet, go ahead and do so. As I said, you'll get your CE certificates tomorrow by lunchtime. And if you only need a general certificate of attendance, that's going to be coming a couple hours after we end here today. But if you have any questions, feel free to email support. Go ahead and sign up for next month's session on December 5th, and we shall see you next time, everybody. Thank you so much, Charlie.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for listening.
Of course. All right, everybody. See you next time.